Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation hosted by the Bowman Center for Sustainable Energy. My name is Marshall Kern. It's my pleasure to be the president of this all-volunteer organization. We have approximately 24 associates who have lived and worked across Canada and come together now to promote a sustainable energy future for Canada. With great humility and friendship, we recognize that our national office in Sarnia is on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg people. Today we have a presentation being delivered to us by a team of researchers at Queen's University whom we have supported and sponsored over the last year. And I'm very pleased to acknowledge that a couple of the Bowman Center associates are with us who have been working with the research team. Ed Brost and Peter Smith are here, and over the past few months as well, Dean Jacobs has been participating in the project. My pleasure now is to welcome the leader of the Queen's team and allow her and the other members of the team to make their presentation. Anna Wilisic, please take over.
Thank you, Marshall. Just bear with me for a second as I get our slides shared. All right. Can everybody see those? Just let me know if you can't. Perfect. All right. So we will be talking today about the permanence of geological carbon storage and presenting an overview of carbon sequestration in general. So our team is a team of fourth year Queen's University students. We have Harry Atwood in environmental science, Cheyenne Bachani in political studies, Haley Jamison West in chemical engineering, David Yang in computer science, and myself, Anna Wasilic, in mathematics and engineering. First of all, some acknowledgements. We would like to acknowledge that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and we are grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands. A big thank you to the Bowman Center for giving us this opportunity, and especially thanks to Ed Brost and Peter Smith for all the feedback they've given us over this term. So an introduction to the context of our problem here. There is no doubt that human and anthropogenic activities have resulted in global warming, and at the Paris Agreement in 2015, countries around the globe agreed to keep warming well below 2 degrees Celsius by reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So the question is how we are going to get to net zero emissions. One big strategy is climate change mitigation, which is the reduction and or removal of atmospheric carbon to mitigate climate change. So carbon sequestration, which is what we'll be focusing on today, is a mechanism for climate mitigation. It's not the primary strategy, that is, that would be transitioning to clean energies and changing land management practices, but it can be used to get us to net zero by 2050 via the reduction and removal of CO2 in the atmosphere. And what we're specifically looking at today is the permanence of carbon sequestration methods. It's ultimately the capture and storage of carbon in carbon pools. So we're going to be looking at how long that carbon is stored. Our objectives for the presentation are to, one, review the spectrum of permanence, so go over kind of the various carbon sequestration methods and look at how long they last for, present an overview of geological carbon sequestration in particular, and investigate the permanence of geological carbon sequestration. And an overview of the presentation. We'll start off with a stakeholder analysis and then go into the permanence of sequestration methods. We'll touch on carbon capture and transportation, and then go into a deep dive in geological carbon storage. We'll talk about immobilization and trapping, leakage and well remediation, the injection process and monitoring before presenting our conclusions on permanence. So I'll hand it off to Cheyenne now. Cheyenne, are you ready? Oh, I think you're muted still. I'll give her one more second.
Don, if you could please unmute Cheyenne.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Anna. So when examining the multifaceted landscape surrounding carbon capture and storage technologies, it is imperative to analyze the perspectives of key stakeholders whose interests intersect with economic, environmental, and social aspects. Those stakeholders include oil and gas companies, the public, Indigenous peoples, and the government. Next slide, please. Oil and gas companies, recognized as significant contributors to carbon emissions due to their involvement in industrial processes, are pivotal stakeholders in carbon capture and storage initiatives. Their engagement with carbon capture and storage stems from a variety of motivations, including the imperative of regulatory compliance with evolving environmental standards and a desire to enhance corporate social responsibility standards. These motivations reflect the complex intersection between regulatory requirements, societal expectations, and business imperatives within the industry. One example of industry innovation in the carbon capture and storage landscape is carbon engineering. Known for its work within direct air capture technology, carbon engineering represents a leading force in advancing carbon capture solutions. Direct air capture technology, involving the direct removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, presents a promising avenue for emissions mitigation, and it is also important to acknowledge other companies that are highlighted by the Government of Canada in the carbon capture and storage landscape, such as CarbonCrete and CarbonCure. These companies focus on carbon stored concrete solutions, offering sustainable alternatives to traditional concrete production methods. Similarly, companies like Svanti have emerged as key players in the general capture of carbon dioxide from industrial sources, providing scalable solutions for emissions reductions across various sectors. Next slide, please. Likewise, the public's perception of carbon capture and storage emerges as a critical determining factor of its feasibility. Informed public discourse facilitated by organizations like the Pembina Institute is essential in garnering public support. These organizations provide valuable platforms for dialogue, education, and engagement, enabling citizens to make informed decisions about carbon capture and storage technologies. Addressing concerns regarding environmental impact, societal implications, and economic viability is essential in shaping public opinion. Transparency and open communication are essential in fostering trust and confidence among the public. Moreover, public engagement initiatives such as community consultations and public forums provide opportunities for citizens to voice their opinions, express their concerns, and contribute to the development of carbon capture and storage projects. By actively involving the public in the decision-making process, stakeholders can build consensus, promoting understanding and enhancing public acceptance of carbon capture and storage technologies. Overall, the public's perception of carbon capture and storage plays a crucial role in its adoption and implementation. By fostering informed public discourse, addressing concerns, and actively engaging citizens in the decision-making process, stakeholders can build trust, enhance transparency, and ultimately facilitate the successful deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies. Indigenous peoples hold a large stake in the discourse surrounding carbon capture and storage, rooted deeply in the preservation of their land, cultural heritage, and traditional way of life. For Indigenous communities, the land is not just a resource, but an entity intertwined within their identity, spirituality, and culture. Therefore, any environmental initiative, including carbon capture and storage projects, must be approached with consideration for Indigenous rights, values, and interests. By recognizing Indigenous knowledge, perspectives, and rights, stakeholders can gain the unique insights and expertise of Indigenous peoples in shaping sustainable solutions for climate change mitigation. Partnerships in Alberta serve as great examples of this cooperative approach, emphasizing Indigenous participation in climate change mitigation efforts. Through initiatives such as the Open Access Wabamun Carbon Hub, Indigenous communities have been engaged as equal partners in the development and implementation of carbon capture and storage projects in Alberta. These partnerships prioritize mutual respect, trust, and shared decision-making, fostering a sense of ownership and empowerment among the Indigenous communities. These collaborative efforts extend beyond just the involvement of Indigenous peoples as stakeholders. They represent opportunities for capacity building, economic empowerment, and community development within Indigenous communities. Next slide, please. The government, as a key stakeholder, plays a central and pivotal role in shaping the landscape of carbon capture and storage development. Through its authority in policymaking, regulation, and investment, the government influences the trajectory and viability of carbon capture and storage initiatives within Canada. Initiatives such as the Energy Innovation Program highlight Canada's commitment to carbon reduction and the advancement of clean energy technologies. By allocating resources and funding towards research, development, and implementation of carbon capture and storage projects, the government demonstrates its proactive stance in addressing climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Regulatory frameworks established by the government play a crucial role in ensuring the safety, environmental sustainability, and social responsibility of carbon capture and storage projects. By setting clear standards and guidelines, the government aims to mitigate potential risks and safeguard public health, safety, and welfare. Moreover, regulatory frameworks necessitate alignment with public sentiment and industry standards. By incorporating diverse perspectives and feedback, regulatory frameworks can better reflect societal values, preferences, and priorities, enhancing their effectiveness and legitimacy. Through policymaking, regulation, and investment, the government shapes the enabling environment for carbon capture and storage initiatives, driving innovation, ensuring accountability, and advancing Canada's transition to a low-carbon economy.
All right, thank you, Cheyenne. So now that we know who the key players are, we can get into, there we are. Okay, so now that we've talked about the key players, we can get into what carbon sequestration is as a process. So carbon sequestration is essentially any process that captures and stores carbon in a carbon pool. So there's a variety of different ones. New ones are emerging every year. We'll just go over the main, most prominent ones in the industry right now. So the terrestrial carbon sequestration methods include afforestation and reforestation, or referred to as the forestry methods. So this is basically just planting a bunch of trees and managing forested lands to increase the capture of CO2 by trees. Soil carbon sequestration involves the land management practices that result in an increase in the fixing of carbon into soils via vegetation and also fertilizer, and it involves, reduced tilling so that you don't till the CO2 out of the soil. And biochar is the capture of CO2 into charcoal, and it's a very long-lasting method. In terms of oceanic methods, we have coastal blue carbon, which is kind of similar to forestry methods, but instead of encouraging forest growth, you're encouraging growth of seagrasses and protecting tidal marshes, which are natural carbon sinks. And enhanced ocean alkalinity, which is the injection of alkaline substances into the ocean to decrease ocean acidification and increase carbon sequestration. There are a couple other oceanic methods, such as deep ocean storage and artificial upwelling, but given the risks associated, they're not currently being considered as viable options. We may see if in the future technology allows them to be options. In terms of our geologic storage options, we have enhanced weathering, which is essentially the mineralization of CO2. Geological carbon storage, which will be the focus of our report, that is the injection of CO2 into deep underground formations, and the utilization of CO2 in long-lived products. Notably, we have enhanced oil recovery, but in terms of permanence, we're more looking at the storage of CO2 in concrete. So when we're looking at these sequestration methods, we need a way to compare them in terms of duration. So we need a way to kind of measure permanence. Now, the first time permanence came up was in 1997 in the Kyoto Protocol, and the Kyoto Protocol made the distinction only between permanent and impermanent storage, where permanent storage was referred to as the geological methods and impermanent was the forestry methods. So at that time in 1997, those were the only sequestration methods being considered, and so the terminology didn't really reflect the variety of sequestration options. Now, 20 years later, in 2024, there are way more sequestration options, and so we need better terminology to assess how permanent something truly is. So now, instead of permanent and impermanent, we're looking at the permanence of a process, equivalently the durability and risk of reversal. These terms are all used interchangeably in literature, and there actually isn't a universally accepted definition of these terms, which is one of the problems that we will be addressing in this report. We're going to try and stick to one form of terminology, but you may find different things in different literature. What we will use today in our terminology is permanence as the duration or period of time for which a sequestration method isolates carbon from the atmosphere, and then risk of reversal as the likelihood of premature reversal of sequestration. So separate from the time that something is intended to store carbon for, you can have the risk that that whole process is reversed. An example of reversal is in forestry methods, you could have a forest fire or drought, and that could wipe out the entire forest and thus release a bunch of CO2 into the atmosphere. In the context of geological storage, reversal is essentially leakage. So we'll be looking at the risk of leakage. And I just have a little graphic here to kind of illustrate the spectrum of permanence. In the decades to centuries kind of area, we have the terrestrial methods and coastal blue carbon. They're very effective for short-term a capture of carbon, but they're not very good long-term solutions. In the thousands of years, we have biochar, and then in the tens of thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years, we have enhanced weathering and geological carbon storage. So this is the permanence, assuming that no premature leakage is going to occur. So what we want to investigate is how likely that risk of leakage is. Why we're focusing on GCS specifically is because of the legacy of the Kyoto Protocol. It is thought of as permanent in most literature. A surprising amount of literature just calls it a permanent process and doesn't specify what permanent means or how long that is. So that's kind of why we honed in on GCS as our topic. We're going to investigate how permanent it truly is, because we know that the duration is long. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of years, and the risk of reversal is lower than that of forests. But can we truly call it permanent? Can we truly say that the CO2 is never going to escape and be stored underground forever? So that's what we're going to look at today. The questions we're answering are: how does leakage occur? How likely is leakage? What happens if leakage does occur? And the like. So now I'll hand it off to David to talk about carbon capture.
Don Greaves, can you please unmute? Unmute David Jiang. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Anna. So to start off this whole sequestration process, we're going to be talking about how the carbon is actually captured. Now, there are three main types of carbon capture. So carbon capture on the industrial side, direct air capture, and bioenergy capture. Now, we're going to be focusing on the industrial, under the industrial side context, since the carbon capture under industrial terms, it prevents the carbon dioxide from actually being released into the atmosphere, whereas direct air and bioenergy is actually taking carbon from the atmosphere in other areas. However, focusing on the industrial side, this process can be improved in addition to direct air and bioenergy if we combine them together. Next slide, please. So focusing on the industrial side, there are three main ways to capture it. So pre-combustion, post-combustion, and oxy-fuel combustion. Pre-combustion is where the carbon is captured before the fuel is combusted, and post-combustion is where the carbon is captured after the fuel is combusted. And on the right here, we can see a little graphic as to the theory behind post-combustion capture. And oxy-fuel combustion is where the fuel is combusted in a near pure oxygen environment as opposed to just a normal air environment. This makes the carbon capture a lot more easier. However, it might be a little more costly considering that we have to use pure oxygen for this. Now, after the carbon is captured, we have to compress it to a supercritical state for us to transport and store it later. Now, this is done via a centrifugal compressor. Next slide, please. So for transportation, there are a couple methods as well. The main ones are pipelines, cargo, and trucks and rail, so land transport. Now, we found out the the preferred transportation method are pipelines, since these are the most stable and safe way of transportation. As with cargo ships, the development for the technology of transporting supercritical carbon is in its infancy, and there are a lot of risks that come along with cargo transport, such as the ship being stranded or containers bursting. It's transportation by land is also the same, where the containers may burst that there could be collisions and the containers could burst because of the vibrations on land.
All right, thank you, David. So now we'll get into the actual geological storage. So for a geological site to be suitable for storage, it needs to meet three fundamental criteria. Capacity, which means that it has to have the volume essentially to store the desired amount of CO2. Injectivity, which means that it has to be able to accept the CO2 at the rate that it's being produced from the source. So if you're producing CO2 from your carbon capture source way faster than you can inject it into the ground, then you're going to have a problem there. And then very importantly, containment, which means that the reservoir must be able to contain the carbon dioxide within the confinement zone. So for most sedimentary reservoirs, this translates to the presence of a non-permeable caprock over top of the permeable reservoir. So the geological media that meet these three fundamental criteria are saline aquifers, which are deep water reservoirs that have that's called brine, so essentially salty water in them. Depleted hydrocarbon reservoirs, which are oil and gas wells, which have been the industrial processes have finished, they've been extracted already. Unminable coal seams, which are deep coal seams that are either too deep or just too logistically difficult to mine, so they're not useful for industry purposes. Organic rich shales, so these are associated with fracking processes. When fracking occurs, the fracturing that the high pressure water does actually creates a reservoir. So there's issues of, the caprock is fractured, but also the way that the shale forms can be used to then capture it in return. Salt caverns, which is when salt caverns are eroded out of salt beds and then can be used to store gases like hydrogen, methane, or carbon dioxide. And finally, and the most unique one, is igneous formations, which are used specifically in what's called in situ mineralization, which is when there's less focus on a caprock and the carbon is injected for the specific aim of mineralizing it super rapidly. So obviously there's a lot of different options here, but what is actually used in practice the most is saline aquifers and depleted reservoirs. The rest are kind of more emerging technologies, so they may play more of a role in the future. But currently, saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas wells are what we're looking at. So the comparison between the two, saline aquifers have significantly larger global capacity. We're looking at orders of magnitude more compared to depleted oil and gas wells. However, they do require new critical infrastructure such as roads, pipelines, injection wells. Everything that you need for that site is you're going to have to build. And in the act of making a new injection site, you might fracture the caprock, so that adds a bunch of complications. Meanwhile, for depleted oil and gas wells, all that critical infrastructure either exists already or can be rebuilt pretty easily. Another consideration is that saline aquifers require intensive assessment. They need to be evaluated to see many different geochemical properties to see if they're suitable, whereas depleted oil and gas wells, we already have a lot of that data from industrial activity. So which one a company is going to choose depends on if they're looking for a really large scale operation or a small scale fast operation. And now we'll look at trapping mechanisms once the carbon is injected into the reservoir. So there are four that are typical to sedimentary reservoirs. We have structural trapping, which is when the carbon rises due to buoyancy and is trapped by the caprock. Residual trapping, which is when the carbon moves through the porous reservoir and gets trapped in the pores. Solubility trapping, which is when the carbon dissolves into the reservoir fluid. This is typically associated with saline aquifers. And mineralization, which is when the carbon then precipitates out of that brine and forms a stable carbonate mineral. So I just actually have some diagrams here to help visualize for people not familiar. Structural trapping can be seen on the left, so it really is just kind of like an umbrella. It rises up and gets caught under the caprock. And then residual trapping, you can see the pores here as the CO2 moves through the rock grains, little kind of bubbles of it get trapped in the rock and secured by capillary forces. Just a little graphic to help illustrate. And now we'll go back and talk about the contribution of each trapping mechanism over time. So as you can see in the beginning, year one, you're relying almost entirely on structural trapping. You're relying on that caprock to contain everything. So this is the kind of most high risk period. If you fracture the caprock in that period, you're going to have a lot of leakage. Permanence is going to be severely compromised. It's going to be a big problem. And then over time, as you get closer to thousands of years, you have an increase in solubility and mineral trapping, which are much more secure. So, once the carbon is mineralized, it's essentially irreversible unless we directly want to do that, which is not in the cards usually. And solubility trapping as well, there would have to be a really extreme change in pressure for the carbon to abandon the solution. So essentially you're relying on structural trapping for the first, many hundreds of years, but then eventually when you get to thousands, you have a permanent trapping in solubility and mineralization. And now leakage pathways of concern. So there are three that you can categorize them into: caprock permeability, fractures and faults, and wellbores. So caprock permeability is the most avoidable. So although you have an impermeable caprock, obviously some caprocks are not going to be absolutely impermeable. It might not be, zero permeability. There might be a marginal amount. And so if companies are injecting at too fast of a rate, then they can force CO2 through their caprock. And this is very avoidable, but it should be noted because there's obviously financial incentive for companies to inject faster. So they have to be careful not to inject too quickly or else they compromise their caprock. Fractures and faults, this can be avoided through proper site screening. You don't want to use a site where the caprock is fractured. And you also don't want to use a site with a seismic history because even if there aren't current fractures, it could be fractured in the future by earthquakes. If they are present once an operation starts, they're pretty tricky to resolve, but they can be avoided through proper site screening. And the biggest leakage pathway of concern is well bores. So especially in the context of oil and gas wells, they are present in these big fields where there's many injection sites and old well bores from previous industrial activities. And those are a perfect leakage pathway for CO2. So even if they're plugged, the CO2 can like dissolve the cement and metal casing, and it can be a really big problem. And Haley later will talk about the volume of well bores that we have to deal with for this to be viable. So the exact leakage rates depend on the site and injection process. Ideally, you can reach 0, but that would be very difficult. So there's no international standard on what leakage is allowed. However, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has stated that if leakage is kept below 2% over 10,000 years, that is effective for mitigating climate change. So notice that they're not necessarily looking at 0% leakage, they're looking at what is effective enough to mitigate climate change in the present. So that's what current organizations are looking at. All right, now I'll pass it off to Haley to talk about the injection process.
Don Greaves, please unmute Haley Jameson.
Oh, good. Sorry. So I'll be discussing the process of investigating the suitability of using existing oil wells, like a depleted oil well, as a site for injection of carbon dioxide. And that includes the well remediation in both a traditional sense and in the context of injection, and also determining how that site can be suitable based off of characteristics, based off of multiple regulations. So just before I get into that, I'll go through a couple definitions. So obviously an abandoned well is one that is depleted and it's no longer active or actively producing oil or gas. And an orphaned well is an abandoned well that has no known financially viable operator that's capable or responsible of cleaning or closing that well. Remediation includes the removal of contaminants and any hazards at the site. And then reclamation is that final step in the cycle of well recovery, where the land is returned to its pre-development state and it's essentially clear of any memory of anything else. So just have some pictures here. This is like a before and this is after remediation. That's from the Orphan Well Association in Alberta. So well remediation is obviously super important because as of 2020, I believe there was 170,000 abandoned oil wells in Alberta alone. And that can lead over to 22,000 tons of methane released yearly. And so this little map I have here on the right, that's also from the Orphan Well Society, Orphan Well Association, sorry. And so those are all the orphan wells in Alberta as of 2020, where the yellow ones are ones that have been identified by the Orphan Well Association as remediation sites. And those don't even include the ones that aren't tracked, or obviously like some companies just choose not to disclose them. So the process of well remediation, as I said earlier, is removing the contaminants and any hazards at the site, whether that's groundwater, soil, etc., and also the plugging. And as of 2020, there was 100,000 reclaimed wells in Alberta. However, in the context of injection processing, to get it into an injection site, you wouldn't plug the well because obviously you're interested in using that well hole as an injection zone. So in a study done by the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer in 2020, it was expected that to clean all of the orphan wells nationally, it was going to cost about $1 billion. And this is obviously including the contamination removal and the plugging of all these orphan wells. So this cost projection was based off of the existing number of orphan wells in 2020 in Alberta, gross to a national scale, and then accounting for an increase in orphan wells as the wells get depleted. Like some companies may go bankrupt, etc. Some just might abandon them and leave them and give up their responsibility for them. So if we get to the injection well, so what an injection well really looks like is it's defined as both an injection zone, which is where the movement of the compressed carbon dioxide occurs from the surface to the confining zone about a mile under the surface. And the confining zone is an umbrella term really for any of those reservoirs that Anna was talking about, whether that's a saline aquifer or a depleted oil and gas reservoir. And as Anna said earlier, there's a impermeable caprock or some kind of barrier that prevents fluid flow upwards. And again, that can be any reservoir type. So to determine the suitability of a site, there's a couple characteristics, obviously, that you would need to account for. And this is a lot of data. And because those wells are often orphaned, they don't have a lot of data that comes with them. And there's a lot of money that goes into that to collect the data that makes it accessible to then be measured as an injection site. But some of those characteristics are obviously the maps and cross sections of the area of review. Obviously, where is it? Can I get there? How hard is it to get the equipment there? Location and properties of known or any suspected faults, or those are the fractures in the cap rock. And then obviously we need the depth, area, thickness, mineralogy, capillary pressure of both the injection and confining zones to first model that process and then to execute it. And also we need the seismic history of the site to determine if there's any risk in the future for seismic activity to disrupt the structure and cause CO2 leakage. So the injection process, once a site's been deemed to be suitable and it has all these perfect characteristics, the first step is almost always a simulation of the reservoir system, whether that's a saline aquifer, abandoned oil well, etc. And since the carbon, as David mentioned earlier, it's compressed during the transportation process to make it more effective. The same applies in that injection process, where if it's in a supercritical CO2 state, it's going to behave a little bit more of a liquid, and it will actually maximize the use of that capacity of that reservoir. And then obviously compression, it's been simulated, it's all good to go at this point. The injection into the confining zone, it's incredibly important for that monitoring of the CO2 injection during the injection and after, which Harry will get into later. And just in this image on the right here, I'm just emphasizing the importance of the monitoring of that leakage. We have the CO2 injection well on the far right, but there's also a CO2 monitoring well and a groundwater monitoring well, just to show how important those leakage monitoring ways are. Another thing that's very important in the injection process and monitoring is managing the pressure of the reservoir, because it cannot exceed the cap rock fracture pressure. And in that, so this is again like data that we need for an orphaned well, and it can take weeks, months to get this data. But to control the pressure of the reservoir so that it doesn't exceed that and cause fracture of the cap rock, you can control the injection pressure, the rate, and the site of injection to determine if there's any weak spots in that reservoir or not. And then also in the case of saline aquifers, you can extract the brine to decrease volume and then essentially decrease pressure.
I think Harry needs to be unmuted now.
Don Greaves, can you unmute Harry Atwood, please?
All right, awesome. Thank you, Haley. So I'm going to be talking about monitoring techniques, and I'm really focused on three. We're focused on radiocarbon analysis, colorimetric CO2 sensors, and remote sensing, and each of which offer their own unique advantages when it comes to monitoring carbon capture and storage leakage. So if we go to the first slide, I'm going to detail radiocarbon analysis, which is really good at effectively detecting and locating CO2 leaks from CCS facilities. And this method uses the fact that fossil fuel emissions don't contain radiocarbon, unlike natural CO2 sources, to tell them apart. And this technique is good because it can detect small fossil-derived CO2 changes as small as 1 ppm, which enables it to pinpoint leaks near their source. Additionally, it allows for the use of different biological materials for sampling. This method is a significant advancement for ensuring the effectiveness and safety of carbon capture and storage operations. They are also highly sensitive. So if we go to the next slide, then we're going to talk about colorimetric CO2 sensors. So colorimetric CO2 sensors are affordable portable devices that are designed for monitoring carbon capture and storage sites. And these sensors address a common limitation of traditional CO2 monitoring methods, that being the cost. They work by measuring CO2 concentrations through a pH indicator in a gas permeable membrane, which in turn offers a rapid response to even low levels of CO2. And notably, all monitoring can be done by your smartphone. And these sensors' effectiveness have been showcased through laboratory tests where they're accurately able to detect CO2 concentrations ranging from as low as 0.1 to 30%. Additionally, they can detect CO2 leakage at both natural and engineered leaking sites. Further development for the CO2 sensor is necessary to enhance its precision, particularly when it comes to its performance in diverse lighting and long-term resilience in outdoor environments. And then if we head to the next slide. talking about remote sensing. Remote sensing in CCS applications harnesses both active and passive approaches to monitoring. Passive remote sensing detects naturally occurring emissions from targets, while active sensing involves emitting radiation and then observing the response. This enables the use of technologies that can measure CO2 concentrations and surface deformations, enhancing the monitoring of CCS sites. Surface deformation monitoring is crucial for assessing the impact of CO2 injection on underground reservoirs and the adjacent environment. Techniques like LiDAR, UAV photogrammetry, and INSAR are instrumental in identifying potential leakage points and providing a detailed analysis of ground movements and deformation patterns, thus contributing to the integrity and safety of CCS operations. And then when it comes to ecological environment monitoring, this is vital for detecting CO2 leaks and their consequent effects on local ecosystems and vegetation. This involves a range of techniques from vegetation and thermal anomaly monitoring to soil composition analysis and biological surveys, which help pinpoint changes indicative of CO2 leaks. These methods are essential for informing emergency response strategies and serving as early detection systems, thereby protecting ecological health in areas surrounding CCS sites. And if we head into the next slide, in this section, we're done with the monitoring part. In this section, we analyze both the impacts of carbon capture processes and leakage on the environment and human health. And then we're going to focus on two categories, that being large-scale CCS operations and the impacts of leakage from CCS reservoirs. So we'll start with large-scale CCS operations. The effects of CCS leaks must be examined. And in a study by Vinca et al. In 2017, they showed that even leakage rates as low as 0.01 to 0.1% per year could result in up to 25 gigatons of CO2 emissions throughout the 21st century, as shown in the figure. And the goal of CCS is obviously to decrease the effects of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if leakage occurs on any scale, it can be shown to be a significant issue. And if we head into the next part, the potential for CO2 leakage from carbon capture and storage facilities can affect groundwater integrity as it carries the risk of acidifying the water and mobilizing toxic elements that are harmful to both human health and natural ecosystems. Freshwater aquifers also differ in their vulnerability to such contamination. These aquifers depend on precipitation for replenishment and are susceptible to the influence of human activities. The oil and gas sector is known for employing similar subsurface injection techniques to CCS and has a history of incidents leading to groundwater contamination. This underscores the threat that CCS poses, as aquifers that are closer to the surface and consist of permeable materials such as sand or gravel are particularly prone to pollution. And given these considerations, the likelihood of CO2 leakage from CCS sites into these aquifers is significant. And then leakage from CCS transport pipelines or reservoirs can increase CO2 concentrations in soil, which has been shown to have a range of detrimental effects on plant life. One example is in a study by Al-Trabusi et al. In 2012 demonstrated a strong link between heightened CO2 in the soil and decreased oxygen levels, resulting in hypoxic conditions harmful to plant development. Seedling emergence and growth were particularly affected. For instance, seeds with soil with more than 50% CO2 failed to emerge, while those in environments with 5 to 20% CO2 showed emergence and survival, but had compromised health. This research underscores the interplay between CO2 and oxygen in soil ecosystems and the critical need to monitor and manage CO2 levels to prevent damage to plant life.
All right, thank you, Harry. So we've touched on the entire process of geological carbon storage from site screening to injection to monitoring. And yeah, so again, there's no one leakage rate that we can estimate. It really depends on the site. As I said, the IPCC has identified that leakage of 2% over 10,000 years is enough to be effective mitigation for climate change. So although that wasn't our main question, we have discovered that yes, climate change can be mitigated via geological carbon storage. However, it is not necessarily permanent. Leakage rates really depend on the quality of regulation, how much governments let companies get away with, if they inject too quickly and crack their cap rock, that kind of thing. If they don't do a good job sealing their oil wells or their abandoned wells, that will all lead to leakage. And what rate the governments think is acceptable is going to affect leakage over time. So obviously in the immediate future, in the next 1,000 years, 10,000 years, we're not seeing much leakage. But even just estimating, if you have 2% leakage every 10,000 years, then after only 500,000 years, you've lost almost the entire amount that you've injected. And that's obviously a very, very long time. but it means that we cannot confidently assert that geological carbon storage is permanent. It's a solution for us right now to mitigate climate change, but after admittedly, a very, very long time, hundreds of thousands of years, there will be carbon leakage back into the atmosphere of a significant scale. So that's about all we have for everyone today. Yeah, I'll open the floor to Marshall to start the Q&A.
Thank you very much. For anybody who does have a question, please enter that into the chat function and I will moderate the questions as they come through. Anna, you mentioned that all of the members of your team are fourth-year students in various disciplines. What do you have as an expectation for your career after this term is done and you've successfully completed this year?
Thank you, Marshall. Yeah, I'm in mathematics and engineering, but I'm very interested in sustainable technologies and issues just like this. So I'm thinking about grad school. I'm trying to decide which field to go into, but recently I've been considering potentially nuclear, which I'm sure Peter can give me plenty of advice on. Yeah, so potentially nuclear energy, we'll see, maybe grad school.
Thank you. And Cheyenne, same question to you. What does the future hold for you? Are you able to unmute?
Sorry, I was just waiting to be unmuted. I have been evaluating my options, either doing further education or getting straight into work and maybe exploring post-grad schooling after getting some more work experience. But my past internships have been around sustainability and research and development, so it's definitely something along that path.
Thank you. And Haley, same question to you. What does the future hold for you now, leaving this program?
I'm actually doing another year because I transferred into engineering. So I got to make up a couple things I've missed. So probably just going to do that. Maybe I'll do another project like this eventually. And then when I graduate, I want to get into something with chemical engineering and something sustainable for sure.
Great. Thank you very much. And Harry Atwood, what is your next step?
So far I'm not completely sure, but I've been pretty interested in like some environmental law courses that I've taken. So potentially maybe law school to get involved in maybe environmental law, but then also I was really interested also in like sustainable business practices and just sustainability as a whole. So I'm kind of undecided, but my next year is just going to be trying to make some money to, fund that.
And finally, David Jiang, what's the future for you?
I think you're not coming through, David. I'm not sure.
Okay, try again, David.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So being computer science is not exactly related to the energy industry, but I do have a master's lined up at Queen's. So that's the plan for now. And hopefully the research can be applied to sustainable energy in that particular field. So.
Very good. Thank you. I do have one question that occurred to me as you were speaking, as everyone was speaking about storage, looking at the three key components there of capacity, injectivity, and containment. It struck me that what you've been identifying is that when a site is quantified, when a site is identified, it's not going to be scalable, that we're not going to be able to expand that particular site indefinitely. There's going to be something about that site that limits the amount of supercritical CO2 that can be injected. Is that your understanding as well, that each identifiable site has a limitation, that it's not going to be infinitely scalable?
Yeah, I can start this one off. I think that definitely is true. That's one of the benefits of the terrestrial storage methods is even though they're significantly less long-term, they are way more scalable than CCS. And one thing to consider also is that when we're evaluating capacity for geological storage, a lot of CCS companies or institutes will make very large claims about the capacity. We have more than enough capacity for all the storage we could ever want. However, if that storage was all mobilized at the same time, it affects itself, if that makes sense. So if you mobilize all these aquifers and increase the pressure, the reservoir pressure of all these aquifers at the same time, that actually reduces the capacity and injectivity of surrounding aquifers. So if you mobilize every single CCS reservoir available, then you're reducing the capacity significantly. So it's not actually clear right now exactly how much space we have available for that.
Okay, and given a particular site, given the space that may be available, the question gets to monetizing this. How does carbon capture and storage get monetized? How is it paid for? How does it actually generate a return if possible?
I'll start off and then maybe Cheyenne would like to add on because I think she studied enhanced oil recovery or worked in that field. But yeah, a big one is enhanced oil recovery. This is where it gets a little questionable though, because you can turn a profit if you reutilize the CO2 you inject it into oil wells and extract more oil out of those wells. Injecting the CO2 immobilizes the remaining oil in the wells. And then in the process, you're capturing some CO2, not a huge amount, it's not intended for storage. But first you can mobilize that captured CO2 for EOR, enhanced oil recovery, and then you can store it permanently long term. So this can decrease the costs, but at the same time, you're producing more petroleum fuels. So that kind of also, it's a bit of a questionable practice because you are reducing the cost of GCS, but then at the same time, you're producing more petroleum fuels. And I'll open it to the other teammates if they want to add on.
Cheyenne, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, additional to the enhanced oil recovery, another method for the carbon to be stored in kind of a reusable way is what I mentioned in the stakeholder analysis. There's a couple companies that use carbon captured and they store them within cement. So there's like companies that put the stored carbon in their concrete. So obviously that would be useful when concrete is being sold anyways, but at the same time, it's being stored as well.
Great. Any other thoughts on how do you monetize carbon capture and storage? Okay, the other team members are quiet at that. That's great. And the question then is coming up, can injection rates in a particular site be increased using horizontal wells? Because the example images that you've provided have been just a vertical well. And certainly most of the abandoned oil wells traditionally have just been a straightforward vertical well. Is there anything that horizontal well drilling would be able to do to achieve improved efficiency or effectiveness of work within an aquifer?
I'll kick this one off. That's not something we studied in particular, but based on what knowledge we do have of the plume migration, I assume the horizontal well would allow for faster migration away from the well and thus increased injectivity rates. So that seems like it could be a good possibility. It's something we should probably look into in the future, but I don't think we did a lot of research on horizontal wells. I'll leave it to anyone else if they want to add on.
Haley? John, can you unmute Haley, please? Thank you.
I was just gonna say I agree. I was kind of focusing on those abandoned oil wells, and a lot of the ones that I saw, at least I did a lot of research with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. They have an entire almost legislation and kind of documentation on how do you determine if a well is suitable for injection. There's a lot of documentation on that, and all of that really focus on those vertical wells. But I do agree with Anna on the horizontal one. The plume would definitely migrate much faster for sure. And then that might make the pressure management way easier or make it harder depending on the depth of it, I guess.
Great. Again, a reminder to anybody, if you do have a question, please enter that into the chat function. And I have another question that occurred to me as the presentation was underway, and this is about the monitoring of the different wells, radiocarbon analysis monitoring and the colorimetric method, as well as remote sensing. I recognize that some of those techniques are already commercially available, but in your research, as you were checking various pieces of literature, is there obviously something that is still cutting edge? Is there an opportunity for new intellectual property to be developed, new research in those particular areas?
That one we can pass straight off to Harry. That's his monitoring was his specialty, so I think he'll need to be unmuted.
Hey, can you guys hear me okay? Okay,
Yes.
awesome. Yeah. So I guess kind of what I found too is there's definitely more examples of monitoring than what I was able to mention too. And I think a lot of it is because a lot of it is emerging technology when it comes to, there's a lot of emerging technology when it comes to monitoring CCS leakage. Um, and I found like, especially with some of the examples that I was looking at, um, I think one of the biggest things that I found was that there's a lot of recommendations to use not just one type of monitoring because each has their own specific strengths and weaknesses, but that maybe actually the best possible option to do would be to use maybe a combination of different monitoring techniques, and that maybe that would be able to offer the most like comprehensive, um, the most comprehensive form of leakage monitoring.
Thank you. I appreciate that. There's one question that is coming from the room here in Sarnia. This one is intimidating because Ed has stuck his hand up to ask a question.
So yeah, when you inject CO2 in supercritical state, whatever, into a saline aquifer, the saline is basically salty water. Water is not compressible. It's trapped under the clap rock. That's one of the criteria that it's sealed. And so what happens? You mentioned, I think, Anna, that the cap rock, the pressure will increase, and that's kind of obvious. Does the saline get displaced? Is it pushed somewhere? Or is there gas present? Like, I guess really is, how is this capacity of a formation evaluated? Because if it's liquid full of salty water, it's not compressible. If there's a gas cap, then I guess they have to determine the volume of the gas cap. And if the saline is being displaced, like pushed away, is it going to, you talked about contamination of groundwater and soils with CO2, but seems like there could be a contamination of saline, which might be worse than the CO2 in terms of contamination.
Okay, who wishes to tackle that one?
Start off, and then I'm not sure Haley might have research also. But yeah, definitely the pressure management is a big ordeal, especially with saline aquifers. So when they inject the CO2, it displaces the brine out of the pores. So previously the brine was filling the pores and they are water wet, and then the CO2 displaces it all. And CO2 is a non-wetting fluid, so it doesn't wet surfaces the same way that brine does. So you have this interaction there where you get a two-phase system, and how they kind of coexist is that the CO2, it is compressed to a supercritical state, but it can be compressed even a little bit further. And there also may be a layer of cushion gas at the top of the caprock, which can also be compressed. But especially for saline aquifers, one thing they have to consider is the extraction of brine. So they might have to make it all work, they might have to extract a bunch of brine. And then there becomes a question of what do you do with that brine once it's extracted? And absolutely, if you the caprock permeability, if you inject too quickly and brine moves through the caprock, it's not necessarily just CO2 that will move through, brine might also move through, and then you're going to contaminate potentially your freshwater aquifers with brine, which is very unideal. So it comes back to a lot of the pressure management stuff. You really have to be careful when injecting.
Right, well, I'm going to call an end to the question and answer because we've got just a few minutes left, and it's my opportunity then, as the president of the Bowman Center, to sincerely thank the team for the work that you've done over the past number of months with Ed and with Peter and with Dean Jacobs as well. We are grateful for the ongoing support of Queen's University and your advisors to make sure that the projects that are accepted are properly scoped. We've been doing this with Queen's now for more years than I wish to count. I'm looking forward to doing it in the future as well. This recording will be made available on the website for the Bowman Center at bowmancenter.com, and we will be receiving a final report from this research team after they've completed it, after it's been vetted by their advisors, after it's been turned in for their grading. But considering the number of smiles that I see on here, I would expect that the grade will be very favorable indeed. So again, sincere thanks to the research team for delivering on this project, and sincere thanks to Queen's University for this ongoing support. That brings our presentation today to an end, and I wish everybody a very pleasant day.